From today's perspective, we've found an area of wonderful potential in the city centre. Back then, the picture was completely different.
In den 70er Jahren gab es hier.
In the 70s, there was an urban development plan here which envisaged the construction of a central high point in 4 locations.
Ich glaube, bis zu 14 Geschosse.
I think up to 14 stories were permitted here in the development plan at the time.
Und das war wahrscheinlich auch mit dem Grund, weshalb dieses
And that was probably one of the reasons why this site was constantly lying fallow, because the urban development and building law situation was not clear. And therefore, this high point in Karlstrasse, that is, the High Karl, was halved at some point. Thus, it quickly became known popularly as the half-long Charles.
Wurde hier dieser städtebauliche.
And it was on this basis that this urban revitalization competition was launched in order to create an adequate new development here for today's standards.
Also aus heutiger Sicht haben wir.
In today's terms, we find an area of wonderful potential in the city centre. Back then, the picture was completely different. A classic backyard, used as a dark, musty car park, very central and close to the station, but of course also associated with all the problems that come from this kind of urban setting.
Darüber hinaus hatten wir hier auf dem Grund.
In addition, we had an incredibly large portfolio of building law requirements and neighbourhood law constraints on the site. Rights of way, building encumbrances, and last but not least, a very heterogeneous property layout.
Unser Ziel war, das Potenzial
Our aim was to maximize the potential, in other words, to create really high-quality living space here in the city centre, in a hybrid neighbourhood. Not a small entrance facing the city and then the residential block behind it. And so, it was important to us to structure and organize the development accordingly.
Die Gliederung des.
The structure of the ensemble here consists of the urban building block here at the front of this plinth base, which contributes to the urban space.
Und das bietet natürlich hier für.
And of course, this offers the users, the residents, this roof level to sit on the upper floor, forming the inner courtyard.
Die Punkthäuser sind für sich erschlossen.
The multi-story blocks are accessible independently.
2 bis 3 Spänner
You have a small inner core, a 2 to 3 unit organization, and so the flats are exposed and therefore ventilated on several sides.
Flächen durch diese Polygonal.
And through the angles of these walls, through its polygonal shape, you naturally get very different levels of sunlight, natural daylight into each flat. And on the other hand, you also have the opportunity to enjoy really exciting views into the courtyard without having to sit face to face with your neighbour.
Das war so der Grundstock.
That was the basis for polygon design. So for one reason being the spatial flow to bring the urban realm into the courtyard, and the other reason of course the compulsory process of fulfilling all requirements.
Die Gliederung der Fenster, der Fassadenausbildung im Gesicht zum Stadt.
The structure of the windows, the facade design seen from the street level, is derived from the Wilhelminian-style facades of Karlstrasse. The windows are all set very cleanly and precisely, as always seen in old buildings. And we've incorporated this grid pattern here in the office building and into the courtyard at the back.
Da spielt sich das.
The ensemble plays out more and more freely. You're in the green inner courtyard in the city and you want to live and show that. And that's why this change in the facade from the austere to the playful towards the rear. We have this classic perforated facade on the upper stories with angled window reveals. Then we have the plinth which completely wraps around the building. And then you have the sloping upper facade that faces the main street. And here we had to think about how to execute the whole thing.
Es war ja ursprünglich ein
It was originally a clay brick building with a ventilated full brick facade, and on the ground floor a fair-faced concrete facade made from prefabricated elements. In various discussions with the client and the design architect, it was decided partly for financial reasons to move away from the insulated full brick facade and instead use an insulated facade system with brick slabs. In other words, if you have an insulated full brick facade, you have a significantly thicker exterior material than with a brick slab. We can actually say 1/5 of the thickness. Then you have a rear ventilation layer that's also emitted.
Der Stein selber ist ja keine gewöhnliche gegossene Klinkerriemchen.
The brick itself is not an ordinary moulded brick slip, but it's actually a solid brick, from which 2 centimeters were sawn off from the front and back. So that means it's basically a very thin, normal brick, which was then bonded onto the external wall insulation system. In other words, I was able to keep the outside face of the concept design and was able to shrink the whole element towards the perimeter and distribute it over the entire floor surface area. We're talking about around 80 to 85 square meters more floor space.
Das Thema Sockelbereich war dann auch ein sehr...
The plinth area was also a very complex planning issue. And here it was decided, due to the logistics, to realize the whole thing in ETICS, external wall insulation system, because, for example, it would not have been possible to transport the parts to some areas in the rear building complex.
Wichtig war uns,
It was important to us that it wouldn't be a tiled facade, because all the houses that are around us, that are Wilhelminian style, have aged facades that are over 100 years old. And we wanted to recreate that aesthetic here.
lange Sortieren.
And we spent a long time sorting. We brought together very different dark and light colors, erected large sample facades, and finally made the selection.
Es gibt bei solchen
There are
Klinkerfassaden
countless types of clay brick for such facades. There are different joints, and they must be with the window colors.
Der Prozess zu dieser Mischung und zum
The process to achieve this mixture and the overall appearance was very complex.
der beinhaltet die Erstellung einer Musterwand mit verschiedenen Arten von
This included the creation of a sample wall with different types of clay bricks, including from other manufacturers, with different grouting and various silicone joints.
Nach der Entscheidung ist
Once the decision had been made, the chosen clay brick was supplied by Sto in 3 different colors, which were then sorted and rearranged on site and bonded to the facade by hand.
Die Differenzierung zwischen Sockelgeschoss und
The differentiation between the plinth level and the 3 buildings blocks was actually a result of both the urban planning and the interior design requirements.
die Fenster
The
sind.
windows at the plinth level are designed quite differently. It isn't the classic perforated facade, but rather a facade that really opens up generously, which simply needed a different look and feel.
Insofern wollten wir hier ein sehr homogenes.
From this perspective, we wanted a very homogeneous material which would then integrate the large openings visually into the urban realm in a believable way,
Und auch bis in die Leibung nach hinten geführt werden.
and would also be extended into the reveal. This way, it harmoniously integrates this plinth level while suggesting an urban setting.
Dann hat man sich entschieden,
It was then decided to create the windowsills in prefabricated concrete elements, and then together with Sto and WOFA, a plastering technique was developed.
Wir haben große Mustertafeln bekommen, 1,20 Meter.
We were given sample panels so large, measuring 120 centimeters by 120 centimeters, that the Sto technical consultant could hardly carry them. Then the decision was made, okay, this is how it should look. And then it was on to the execution. The execution was anything but easy, because creating a uniform grey facade is no problem. The challenge here was to create an uneven facade with shades of grey.
Und das ist uns gelungen mit Einsatz von verschiedenen Lagen und auch verschiedenen Farben.
And we succeeded by using different layers and different colour tones, which were then sanded by hand with a conventional sander after plastering.
die Auflage der Stadt war eine
The
Trauer.
requirement of the city was to create eaves. The roof had to have the same materiality as the facade, and, of course, we had certain safety considerations. We have a school route, we have a road. In other words, I also have to drain off water and not let it run down the facade.
Und hier hat man dann gemeinsam mit der Firma
Together with WOFA and Sto, we then considered how to achieve the whole thing using a rear ventilated layer with a coordinated system of adhesives, joints and panels in such a way that the rear ventilation works,
funktioniert, die
the moisture drainage works, that the whole thing lasts for a long time,
langlebig
and we can still attach things like the snow guard.
wie den Schneefang.
The fact that we could still route various gutter systems onto the roof at the windows.
So ist dieses ganze Komplex.
That's how this whole complex system came about.
Wie schafft man eine schräge Oberfläche in dem
How
Fall?
do you create a sloping surface so that the clay brick slips can be finished in the same way as on the facade?
Das war die Aufgabenstellung.
Ultimately, that was the task at hand, and the result that then emerged was derived from a pitched roof construction with its corresponding substructure.
Mit dem entsprechenden Unterbau, also mit allem, was da dazugehört, hinter Lüftungsebene.
And everything that goes with it. A rear ventilation layer, underlay sheets, corresponding substructure as for a pitched roof construction, and then on top of the rear ventilation level, battens, on which then the Sto render carrier board was mounted. A reinforcing coat was applied on top, and then the clay brick slips.
In der Ebene der Fassade gibt es praktisch eine innenliegende.
At the top of the facade, there's practically an internal drainage channel. In the classic case, you'd have a gutter on the edge, which was not designed here and would not fit.
Genau hat man die Rinne eben innerhalb der Dämmschicht im oberen Knickbereich integriert als.
For this reason, the gutter was built into the insulation layer in the upper fold, integrated as a box where the rainwater that flows from the slope is collected and drains away through a drainage pipe within the facade system, so that nothing of its construction is visible, and it's technically ensured that the water that drains away does so in a controlled manner and can't get anywhere under the facade or behind the facade or behind the brickwork.
Oder hinter die Verklinkerung eben gelangen kann.
Das Schrägdach hat alles erfordert, Holzbau.
The pitched roof required everything: timber construction, plumbing work, drywall work, and finally plastering and cladding the whole thing. Because this is actually no longer a roof, but a sloping facade, and that's where we really needed everything that was available. So if there had been an invitation to tender for this part of the building, it would have certainly required 6 or 7 companies.
Aus der Erfahrung raus ist es immer das Thema und auch.
From experience, it's always an issue and always a problem getting several companies to work together. Where it comes to conflict and interaction between the trades and the actual execution of the work,
Da hatten wir jetzt den Vorteil, dass wir
we had the advantage that WOFA, which has capabilities in many trades under one roof, meant that we only ever needed to meet with 3 people. We spoke to Mr. Wolf and Mr. Divkovic because the company basically does carpentry work, roof waterproofing, plastering and ethics all under one roof. So it was perfect for us in terms of coordination.
In dem Bereich Schrägfassade habe ich persönlich.
I personally and Mr. Wolf had concerns about the joints in the sloping facade. In other words, that the bricks would work and that there wouldn't be any issues at all. They're oven fired through and impenetrable to moisture.
Unempfindlich. Aber die Fuge waren immer.
But the joints were always a bit of a problem for me, and I thought if something happens, it will happen here, because the joints are somewhat open and porous. The material is very porous. That was the task that we then passed on to Sto, to make a very clear statement as to whether it would work with this slope and whether it could work permanently. And the answer was clear: yes. We overemphasized these deep wall thicknesses by slightly tilting the reveals upwards in order to clearly direct the view towards the urban space and to further exaggerate the play of freedom in the inner courtyard of the residential buildings.
Wir haben Schielungen an den Fenstern.
We have angled reveals on the windows that was resolved with prefabricated elements that Sto already prefabricated at the required angle, which were then clad with brick slips on site.
Wir wollten jetzt, da wir hier in dieser.
Now that we're in this very dense urban setting here, we didn't want to do without the quality of a daylight bathroom. That's why the brick structure was opened up and placed in these frames to provide both privacy and protection from the sun. This means that when we look from the inside out from these bathrooms, it's a really great situation, because the deep formation of this perforated brick section means I can look out very nicely. But I always feel private, because as soon as the view is shifted a few degrees, I have no chance at all to look in from the outside.
Wir haben uns verschiedene Sachen überlegt, ein bedrucktes Glas davor zu.
We'd thought about various things, for example, hanging printed glass in front of it. But it will just be there with no depth, and so we thought about using the solid bricks, which were available because the brick slips made with sawn up solid bricks and so building a grid frame into the window, which is then dowelled into the wall subconstruction. The frame had a series of cylinders allowing the bricks with a hole in the centre to be arranged on top of each other in a staggered formation.
Sie haben ja gesehen,
as you've seen on the way here, how narrow and tight it is and how problematic it was. Such a building project here. So when we arrived here for the first time, we actually thought, discuss material delivery by helicopter with Sto.
Schon allein die Anfahrt.
Even just timing the journey alone to receive materials in the first place was extremely challenging.
Auch dann mit der Logistik.
We also had to organize the logistics and getting the execution times right so that there wasn't too much material at the construction site.
Für die Firma Sto eine Herausforderung.
This was also a challenge for Sto, who had to respond more rapidly and more frequently in order to cope with the limited space.
Ist es uns gelungen, trotz sehr begrenzt.
Despite very limited storage capacity, we managed to ensure that the construction site could operate almost without any problems. A particular case was the sheer volume of insulation material that was needed here. The insulation was very voluminous. In one pack of thermal insulation, you get 2 panels, 1 square meter. That means we must have had 3,000 packs here. The insulation boards were then taken directly from the lorries in appropriate logistics bags to the scaffolding where they were needed. And so the situation on the ground was diffused somewhat.
Aber nichtsdestotrotz, Silo-Logistik, Putzlogistik, später die Klinker.
But nonetheless, silo logistics, plaster logistics, later brick delivery. It all had to be placed here somewhere. To be honest, we don't even know ourselves how we managed to coordinate it all.
Wir sind stolz drauf, wissen natürlich.
We're proud of it, but of course, we also know what went into it.
Und das ist in unserem Beruf einfach schön, Unikate.
In our profession, it's simply beautiful to plan and build unique pieces, which you can then see in reality.
Das ist ja immer eine ganz spannende Situation, wenn man als Architekt.
That's always a really exciting situation when, as an architect, you first design a building, then you see it completed, and for me, much more importantly, to regularly see the buildings again and again. You develop yourself, and of course, you check all the things that you thought about it at the time to see whether it holds up.
Und jetzt bezogen auf dieses Ensemble.
And now, in relation to this building project, I look forward to coming back here every time because it really fulfills all the requirements that we set ourselves.